Jake Morrison stood on the rocky ground of New Haven and watched the morning sun rise over the alien landscape. 3 years had passed since he first stepped foot on this world with his team of human colonists. 3 years of building homes, mining precious metals, and making friends with the native aliens called Zeltharians. Now everything was about to end because of one terrible accident. The Zeltharians were tall creatures with hard shells covering their bodies like armor. They had 4 arms and moved with grace despite their size. Their faces showed intelligence and pride. Jake had learned to respect their ways and their ancient traditions. The humans and Zeltharians had worked together. Well, until yesterday, when the mining equipment failed, 12 Zeltharian workers died in the cave collapse. The safety systems that Jake's people had installed should have worked, but they did not. Metal supports snapped like twigs, and tons of rock crushed the workers before anyone could help them. Jake had run into the mine himself, trying to save them, but it was too late. The bodies were pulled out one by one as families wailed in grief. The Zeltharian Council met through the night to decide what justice looked like. Their leader, Elder Korath, stood before Jake with sadness in his large black eyes. The humans were responsible for the equipment that failed. According to Zeltharian law, someone must pay with their life for the deaths of the workers. Not just any death, but the most horrible punishment their people knew. Lisa Carter stood beside Jake as his second in command. She was tough and smart, and had been with him since the beginning of their journey to New Haven. Her face was pale as she listened to the elder speak about ancient laws and blood justice. Guy Ben Walsh was there too, shaking his head and trying to find words that might change the aliens' minds. Jake knew what was coming before the elder finished speaking. The Zeltharians wanted him buried alive in their sacred death chambers deep, under their temple city. It was a punishment saved for the worst crimes in their culture. The person would be placed in a special chamber that would keep them alive but unable to move or speak. They would stay there forever as payment for their crimes. Lisa grabbed Jake's arm when she heard the sentence. She started to argue that it was not fair and that the equipment failure was an accident. Ben joined her, saying that humans could pay in other ways with money or technology or services. The other colonists behind them began to shout that they would not let this happen to their leader. Elder Korath raised one of his 4 hands for silence. He explained that their laws were clear and could not be changed. If the humans refused to accept justice, then there would be war between their peoples. The Zeltharians had weapons and ships and thousands of warriors. The human colony would be destroyed and every person killed. Jake looked at the faces of his people. There were families with children who had made New Haven their home. There were scientists and engineers and farmers who just wanted to build a new life on this world. He could not let them all die because of his failure to keep the mining equipment safe. He stepped forward and told Elder Korath that he would accept the punishment. Lisa tried to stop him, but Jake pushed her back gently. He said that someone had to take responsibility for what happened, and as the leader, it should be him. The other humans began to cry and beg him not to do this thing, but Jake had made his choice. The ceremony took place at sunset. Jake was led down stone steps into the temple complex, where ancient chambers waited in darkness. The Zeltharians chanted in their old language as they prepared the biosuspension chamber. It looked like a metal coffin with tubes and wires connected to strange machines. Before they put him inside, Jake turned to Lisa one last time. He whispered to her that if he somehow survived this nightmare, he would make sure that humanity never had to kneel before anyone again. She nodded through her tears and promised to take care of their people. The chamber closed over Jake's body, and machines began to hum. Chemicals flowed through the tubes, making his mind foggy and his body numb. The last thing he saw was the stone ceiling above him getting darker and darker until everything went black. The Zelfarians sealed the chamber and left him. There to think about his crimes for all time. Above ground, Lisa led the colonists back to their settlement. They would have to find a way to live under Zelfarian rule now that their leader was gone. None of them knew that the ancient machines in the death chamber would do more than just keep Jake alive. They would change him in ways that the aliens never expected. Jake Morrison felt something pulling him back from the darkness after what seemed like forever. His mind was cloudy and confused as strange sounds reached his ears. Metal was creaking and breaking around him. Water dripped somewhere nearby. The biosuspension chamber that had been his prison was falling apart after many years. His eyes opened slowly, and bright light hurt them. The chamber lid had cracked, and sunlight was coming through holes in the stone ceiling above. Jake tried to move his arms, and was surprised when they actually worked. The machines that had kept him frozen in place were dying, and their control over his body was fading. Jake pushed against the cracked lid until it broke completely. He sat up in the chamber and looked around the ancient room. Everything was covered in dust and rust. Some of the Zelfarian machines were still working, but barely. Others had stopped completely, and their lights were dark. The air smelled old and stale. He climbed out of the chamber on shaky legs. His body felt different somehow, stronger and faster than he remembered. His vision was sharper, and he could hear sounds from far away. The biosuspension technology had done more than just keep him alive. It had changed him in ways he did not understand yet. Jake found a way out of the underground chambers and climbed up through broken stone passages. When he finally reached the surface, he could not believe what he saw. The new haven he remembered was gone. In its place was a huge city with tall buildings and strange vehicles flying through the air. The Zelfarian temple complex was now surrounded by massive structures that reached toward the clouds. Everything looked different, but Jake could tell this was still the same world. The mountains in the distance were the same ones he remembered. The color of the sky was the same, but the planet was now covered with Zelfarian cities and technology. Signs everywhere were written in their language, and Jake realized his place was no longer called New Haven. He moved carefully through the edges of the city, trying to understand what had happened. From what he could see, the Zelfarians had built a massive empire. Their ships filled the sky, and their soldiers marched through the streets. Other alien species walked among them, but they all looked like servants or slaves. Jake saw some humans too, but they kept their heads down and moved quickly like they were afraid. The humans he saw wore simple clothes and carried identification badges. They did not look like the proud colonists Jake remembered. These people looked beaten down and scared. Children stayed close to their parents, and adults did not make eye contact with the Zelfarian guards who watched them. Jake hid in an abandoned building and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. More than 100 years must have passed while he was married. The Zelfarians had used that time to build an empire across the galaxy. They had conquered other worlds and enslaved other species, including his own people. As night fell, Jake heard fighting in the distance. Explosions lit up the sky, and he could see smoke rising from several parts of the city. Someone was fighting back against the Zelfarians. Jake moved toward the sounds of battle, hoping to find other humans who had not given up. He found them in the ruins of an old factory. Human fighters were loading weapons and planning their next attack. They moved like soldiers, even though they wore civilian clothes. Their leader was an old woman with gray hair and fierce eyes. She was giving orders to younger fighters who listened carefully to every word. Jake stayed hidden and watched them work. The old woman seemed familiar, but he could not place her. She moved with authority, and the other fighters clearly respected her. When she turned toward his hiding place, Jake saw her face clearly, and his heart nearly stopped. It was Lisa Carter. His Lisa, but aged by more than a century. Her hair was white, and her face was lined with wrinkles, but her eyes still burned with the same fire he remembered. She was alive and still fighting after all these years. Jake stepped out of the shadows and called her name softly. Lisa spun around with a weapon in her hands ready to shoot. When she saw his face, she froze completely. The other fighters raised their guns, but Lisa held up her hand to stop them. She walked toward Jake slowly, like she was seeing a ghost. Her voice shook when she spoke his name. Jake told her it was really him, and that he had escaped from the burial chamber. Lisa reached out and touched his face to make sure he was real, and she pulled him into her arms and held him tight. The other fighters gathered around them as Lisa explained who Jake was. Some of them had heard stories about the legendary captain who had been buried alive to save the colony. Others thought he was just a myth. But here he was standing before them, looking exactly the same as he had more than a century ago. Lisa told Jake about everything that had happened since his burial. The Zeltharians had taken control of the human colony within a few years. They had expanded across the galaxy, conquering world after world. Humans were now second-class citizens in the Zeltharian Empire. They could not own weapons or ships or advanced technology, but Lisa had never stopped fighting. She had built a resistance movement that operated across dozens of worlds. They had weapons hidden in secret places and allies among other enslaved species. They had been waiting for the right moment to strike back at their oppressors. Jake looked at the faces around him and saw hope returning to eyes that had been filled with despair. His return was like a sign that things could change. The man who had been buried alive had come back to lead them to freedom. Jake Morrison sat in the hidden underground base that Lisa Carter had built over the decades. Maps covered the walls showing Zeltharian worlds and shipping routes. Weapons were stored in every corner, and communication equipment hummed quietly. Young human fighters moved through the tunnels, carrying supplies and messages. This was the heart of the resistance that had grown from nothing into a galaxy-wide network. Lisa introduced Jake to Commander Alex Turner, who had become her second in command. Alex was young and fierce with blonde hair and determined blue eyes. She had grown up hearing stories about Jake Morrison and could hardly believe he was real. Alex had been born into slavery under the Zeltharian Empire, but had escaped as a teenager to join the resistance. Jake learned that Lisa had spent over a century building this movement. She had started with just a few loyal colonists after his burial. Slowly and carefully, they had made contact with humans on other worlds. Secret messages were passed through cargo ships and hidden in legitimate trade. Weapons were stolen or built in hidden factories. Safe houses were established on dozens of planets. The resistance was not just humans anymore. Lisa had made contact with other enslaved species across the empire. The Nerians were water-breathing aliens who had been conquered 50 years ago. Their home world had been turned into a mining operation, and their people were forced to work in underwater facilities. Many Nerians had joined the resistance and provided valuable intelligence about Zeltharian naval operations. The Vorthic were crystalline beings who communicated through light patterns. The Zeltharians had enslaved them to work in energy production facilities because their bodies could handle dangerous radiation. Some Vorthic had found ways to send coded messages through the power grids they maintained. These messages helped coordinate resistance activities across multiple worlds. The Lumians were the strangest allies. They were beings made of pure energy, who had been captured and forced to power Zeltharian technology. A few had managed to escape their containment systems and now moved through computer networks, helping the resistance hack into enemy communications. Jake was amazed by what Lisa had accomplished. The resistance had weapons caches hidden on every major Zeltharian world. They had smuggling routes that could move people and supplies without detection. They had sympathizers even among some Zeltharians who had grown uncomfortable with their Empire's brutal methods. Lisa showed Jake detailed plans that had been years in the making. The resistance was ready to strike, but they had been waiting for the right leader and the right moment. Jake's return was the sign they had been hoping for. The legendary captain who had been buried alive had come back to lead them to freedom. Jake studied the intelligence reports and was shocked by how powerful the Zelfarian Empire had become. They controlled over 200 worlds and had military forces that numbered in the millions. Their technology had advanced far beyond what Jake remembered from his time. They had weapons that could destroy entire cities and ships that could travel across the galaxy in days. But Jake also saw weaknesses that the Zelfarians did not know they had. They had become complacent after decades of easy victories. They trusted their technology too much and had forgotten how to fight creative enemies. Most importantly, they had underestimated the species they had enslaved, especially the humans. Resistance had learned to turn Zelfarian technology against them. Mining equipment could be converted into weapons. Cargo haulers could be turned into warships. Communication networks could be used to coordinate attacks across multiple worlds. The Empire's own infrastructure would become the tool of its destruction. Jake met with resistance leaders from other species through secure communication channels. The Nerian commander was named Glub Moore and spoke through a translation device. His people were ready to sabotage the underwater mining operations that provided rare metals to the Zelfarian military. The Vorthic leader was called Lightsinger and communicated through colored flashes. Her people could overload the energy systems on key worlds at exactly the right moment. The planning took weeks as Jake coordinated with cells across the galaxy. Each group had their own targets and their own timeline. The key was to strike everywhere at once, so the Zelfarians could not concentrate their forces to stop any single attack. It would be the largest coordinated rebellion in galactic history. Alex Turner volunteered to lead the assault on the prison planet Korvax, where thousands of human fighters were being held. The plan was to free them and arm them with weapons from hidden caches. These prisoners would become an instant army behind enemy lines. Lisa insisted on commanding the attack on the weapons manufacturing world of Threnix. Jake tried to talk her out of it because of her age, but she reminded him that she had been fighting this war longer than anyone. She knew the Zelfarian systems better than any other human alive. Jake himself would lead the main assault on the capital world that had once been New Haven. It was now called Zelf Prime and served as the center of the Zelfarian Empire. That world would cut the head off the snake and throw the entire empire into chaos. The resistance fighters prepared their weapons and said goodbye to loved ones. Many of them would not survive the coming battle, but they were ready to die for freedom. Jake walked among them and saw the same determination in their eyes that he had seen in his original colonists so many years ago. The night before the attacks Jake stood with Lisa looking at the stars through a crack in the roof of their underground base. She told him that she had never given up hope that he would return someday. Even when others said he was dead, she had kept believing that the biosuspension chamber would eventually fail and set him free. Jake promised Lisa that this time would be different. Humanity would never again bow down to alien masters. They would take their place as equals in the galaxy, or they would die fighting. The man who had been buried alive was ready to dig up some vengeance of his own. Jake Morrison watched the countdown timer reach 0 on his communicator. Across the galaxy, resistance fighters were beginning the largest coordinated attack in history. Every world in the Zelfarian Empire would feel the rebellion starting at exactly the same moment. After more than a century of planning and waiting, the time for vengeance had finally come. The first target was the Fonet Communication Center on Zelf Prime. Jake led a team of 20 fighters through maintenance tunnels beneath the massive facility. His enhanced abilities from the biosuspension chamber made him faster and stronger than any normal human. He could see in the dark and hear guards moving 2 floors above them. The Zeltharian guards never knew what hit them. Jake's team moved, like ghosts through the building, taking out sentries with silent weapons. Within minutes, they had control of the main communication array. Alex Turner's voice came through the radio confirming that similar attacks were happening across dozens of worlds. On the prison planet, Korvax commander Helen Rodriguez led her assault team through the outer defenses. She had studied the guard rotations for months and knew exactly when to strike. The prison gates exploded inward as resistance fighters poured through. Thousands of human prisoners grabbed weapons and joined the attack. Within hours, the entire planet was under rebel control. Weapons manufacturing world of Threenix fell to Colonel Nick Barnes and his mixed species strike team. Nerian swimmers had sabotaged the underwater factories, while Vorthik technicians overloaded the power systems. Barnes led the ground assault that captured the main weapons depot. Now the Resistance had access to military-grade equipment that could match anything the Zeltharians had. Lisa Carter commanded the attack on the shipyard facilities orbiting the industrial world of Murgath. Her team of experienced fighters had spent years learning how to pilot captured Zeltharian vessels. They struck fast and hard, destroying dozens of warships before they could launch. The Zeltharian fleet was crippled before the Empire even knew. They were under attack. Pilot ace Kelly Foster led her squadron in the most daring mission of all. They had to destroy the main fleet command center on the fortress world of Kethver. Flying captured fighters through asteroid fields and nebula clouds, they approached the target undetected. Kelly's bombs turned the command center into a ball of fire that could be seen from orbit. Jake received reports from all the attack teams as his own mission continued. The Zeltharians were confused and panicking as worlds fell to the rebellion one after another. Their military commanders could not understand how so many attacks were happening at the same time. They had always fought primitive enemies who attacked, one target at a time. The Resistance had learned from human military history. They used tactics from Earth's greatest generals and adapted them for galactic warfare. Lightning strikes hit multiple targets, while diversions drew defenders away from key objectives. Supply lines were cut and communication networks were jammed. The Zeltharian Empire was being torn apart from within. Jake's team captured the planetary defense control center and turned the orbital weapons against Zeltharian ships trying to land reinforcements. The mighty empire that had seemed unstoppable was revealing its weaknesses. They had grown soft and lazy after decades of easy victories against inferior enemies. The Nerian commander, Glubmore, reported that the underwater mining operations were completely destroyed. Rare metals that powered Zeltharian technology would no longer flow to their factories. The Vorthek leader, Lightsinger, confirmed that energy production on 12 worlds had been sabotaged. The Empire was losing the resources it needed to maintain its military forces. On some worlds, the local populations rose up to join the rebellion. Species that had been enslaved for generations finally saw hope for freedom. Zeltharian governors found themselves surrounded by angry mobs demanding justice for decades of oppression. The Empire's control was crumbling faster than anyone had expected. Jake moved through the government district of Zelth Prime with growing confidence. His enhanced senses let him detect Zeltharian ambushes before they could be sprung. Enemy soldiers fell to his weapons with deadly precision. The biosuspension chamber had not just kept him alive, but had turned him into something more than human. The Resistance fighters following Jake began to believe that their legendary leader really was unstoppable. Stories spread through the communication networks about the man who had been buried alive and returned with supernatural abilities. Zeltharian troops started to retreat when they heard Jake Morrison was coming. Alex Turner led the assault on the main military command center while Jake's team secured the government buildings. The young commander had learned well from Lisa Carter and fought with the skill of a veteran despite her age. She moved through enemy positions like a force of nature, leaving destruction in her wake. The Zeltharian military tried to organize a counterattack, but their command structure was falling apart. Communications were jammed and supply lines were cut. Their generals could not coordinate their forces or get accurate information about what's happening. The empire that had ruled the galaxy for over a century was collapsing in a matter of days. Jake stood in the main plaza where he had once been sentenced to live burial. Zeltharian bodies lay scattered around the square as rebel fighters secured the area. The temple where he had been entombed for so long was now in human hands. The ancient machines that had changed him were silent, and dark. Reports continued to flood in from across the galaxy. World after world was falling to the rebellion. The Zeltharian Empire was retreating to its core systems as the outer colonies declared independence. Species that had been enslaved were forming their own governments and militaries. But Jake knew the war was not over yet. The Zeltharian Emperor Vorthak the Merciless still controlled the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. He would not give up his empire without a final desperate battle. The ancient alien ruler had never been defeated in combat and commanded weapons that could destroy entire star systems. Jake looked up at the sky where Zeltharian warships were, still fighting resistance forces in orbit. Soon he would have to face the Emperor himself in the final confrontation that would decide the fate of the galaxy. The man who had been buried alive was ready to finish what had been started so long ago. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the captured Zeltharian flagship as his combined fleet approached Zelth Prime for the final battle. Ships from dozens of liberated worlds flew beside him, carrying fighters from every species that had joined the rebellion. Humans, Nerians, Vorthik, and Lumians all united under one cause. The Zeltharian Empire would end today one way or another. Emperor Vorthak the Merciless had pulled back his remaining forces to defend the capital world. His fleet was still massive and filled with the most advanced warships in the galaxy. Weapons that could crack planets waited in the dark of space. The Emperor had ruled for over 200 years and had never lost a single battle. Jake's enhanced senses could feel the tension among his fleet commanders. They knew this would be the hardest fight of the war. Many of them would not survive to see the freedom they had fought for. But they also knew that retreat was not an option. If they failed here, the rebellion would be crushed, and the Zeltharian Empire would rule forever. The battle began when both fleets were still light years apart. Long-range weapons fired across the void as ships maneuvered for advantage. Jake watched the tactical displays as Lisa Carter coordinated the human forces. From her command ship, Alex Turner led the assault squadrons in fast attacks against enemy supply ships. Kelly Foster's pilots flew through the chaos, taking out key targets. Jake himself took command of the main assault force aimed at the heavily defended space stations. Around Zelth Prime, his enhanced reflexes let him process information faster than any normal human. He could see patterns in the enemy movements that others missed. The biosuspension chamber had given him abilities that bordered on supernatural. The battle raged for days as fleets clashed in the space around the capital world. Massive ships exploded in balls of fire that lit up the darkness. Smaller fighters darted between the giants like angry insects. The void was filled with debris and the bodies of the fallen from both sides. Colonel Nick Barnes led a desperate assault on the orbital weapons platforms that protected Zelth Prime. His mixed species strike team fought through heavy defenses to plant explosives on the massive guns. When they detonated, the platforms broke apart in chains of explosions that cleared the way for the main assault. Commander Helen Rodriguez commanded the ground forces that landed on the planet's surface. Her troops had to fight through the capital, city street by street, against desperate Zaltharian defenders. The aliens knew that defeat meant the end of their empire, and they fought with the fury of cornered animals. Jake's flagship broke through the outer defensive lines and headed straight for the Imperial Palace. The Emperor's personal guard fleet moved to intercept them, but Jake's enhanced tactical abilities let him outmaneuver ships that should have been faster and more advanced. He was no longer just human, but something more. The final assault on the palace complex brought Jake full circle to where his journey had begun. The ancient temple where he had been buried alive stood in the center of the Imperial compound. Emperor Vorthak was waiting for him there, surrounded by his elite bodyguards and the most advanced weapons his empire could provide. Jake walked through the temple corridors, where he had been dragged to his living death over a century before. His footsteps echoed in the stone passages as memories of that terrible day came flooding back. But this time, he was not a prisoner being led to punishment. This time, he was a warrior coming for justice. Emperor Vorthak the Merciless stood 8 feet tall with armor that gleamed like black metal. His 4 arms each held a different weapon, and his eyes burned with ancient hatred. He had ruled the galaxy for centuries and destroyed countless civilizations. No enemy had ever stood against him and survived. The Emperor spoke in his harsh language about how Jake should have stayed buried and died in the darkness. He called humans weak creatures who existed only to serve their betters. The Zaltharian Empire would rebuild after crushing this rebellion, and the humans would suffer for their defiance. Jake answered that the Emperor was wrong about humanity. They were not weak creatures who would bow down to tyrants. They were survivors who refused to give up no matter how dark things became. The man who had been buried alive had returned to show the galaxy what humans were really capable of. The 2 warriors circled each other in the ancient chamber where Jake had once been entombed. The Emperor's weapons hummed with energy, while Jake held only a simple blade he had taken from a fallen Zaltharian soldier. But the biosuspension technology had changed him in ways that made him faster and stronger than any normal being. The battle between them was fierce and deadly. The Emperor struck with the skill of centuries of combat experience. His 4 arms moved like lightning as energy weapons fired in all directions. But Jake moved even faster, dodging attacks that should have killed him instantly. Jake's enhanced reflexes let him see the Emperor's moves before they happened. His strengthened body could absorb damage that would cripple a normal human. The ancient machines that had preserved him for over a century had turned him into the perfect weapon for this moment. The Emperor began to realize that he was facing something beyond his understanding. This human moved with abilities that should not exist. Every attack was deflected or avoided. Every weakness was exploited with deadly precision. For the first time in his long life, Vorthak, the Merciless, felt afraid. Jake's blade found its mark, and the Emperor fell to the stone floor of the temple. The alien ruler who had terrorized the galaxy for centuries lay, dying in the same chamber where he had once buried a human alive. Justice had finally come for the Zaltharian Empire. With their Emperor dead, the remaining Zaltharian forces began to surrender. The empire that had seemed unbreakable crumbled as different factions turned on each other. The rebellion had achieved what once seemed impossible. The galaxy was free at last. Jake Morrison stood in the ruins of the Imperial Palace, looking out over a galaxy that was finally free. The Zaltharian Empire had fallen, and dozens of worlds were declaring their independence. But winning the war was only the beginning. Now came the harder task of building something better from the ashes of tyranny. The first challenge was dealing with the remaining Zaltharian forces scattered across the galaxy. Some military commanders refused to surrender and fought desperate battles against liberation forces. Others tried to set up their own small empires on remote worlds. Jake had to coordinate with resistance leaders across hundreds of systems to hunt down these holdouts. Lisa Carter worked tirelessly to establish communication networks between the liberated worlds. Her decades of experience building the resistance proved invaluable in creating the infrastructure needed for a new government. Despite her advanced age, she refused to rest while there was still work to be done. Alex Turner took charge of integrating former enemy soldiers into the new order. Many Zeltharians had grown tired of their empire's brutal methods and were willing to serve under human leadership. It was a delicate process that required careful screening and constant vigilance, but it was necessary for lasting peace. The Nerian. Commander Glubmore helped establish underwater colonies where his people could rebuild their civilization. The aquatic aliens had suffered greatly under Zeltharian rule and needed time to heal. Jake made sure they received the resources and protection they needed to recover. The Vorthic leader Lightsinger worked on restoring the energy systems that had been damaged during the war. Her people's ability to handle dangerous radiation made them essential for rebuilding the power infrastructure across multiple worlds. The crystalline beings took pride in their role in the new galactic community. The Lumians presented a unique challenge since they existed as pure energy and had different needs than biological species. Jake worked with scientists from multiple worlds to create special facilities where the energy beings could live safely while contributing their knowledge to the common good. One of Jake's most important decisions was refusing to simply replace the Zeltharian Empire with a human one. Instead, he pushed for the creation of a democratic federation where every species had equal representation. It was a radical idea that many of his own people questioned, but Jake knew it was the only path to lasting peace. The Galactic Federation was established on the world that had once been New Haven and later Zelth Prime. Representatives from over 50 different species gathered to write the founding documents. Jake insisted that the new government be based on the consent of the governed rather than the rule of the strong. Many former Zeltharians joined the Federation willingly once they saw that the new government offered them equality rather than revenge. Jake surprised everyone by appointing several reformed Zeltharian officials to important positions. He believed that building trust was more important than settling old scores. The biosuspension technology that had preserved Jake for over a century became one of the Federation's most valuable resources. Scientists from multiple species worked together to improve and adapt it for peaceful purposes. Medical advances that had once been used for punishment now saved countless lives. Jake himself became the first guardian of the Federation with the responsibility of protecting democratic values across the galaxy. His enhanced abilities and legendary status made him the perfect symbol of the new order. The man who had been buried alive and returned with vengeance had chosen to build rather than destroy. Years passed as the Federation grew stronger and more stable. Trade routes connected worlds that had been enemies. Scientific knowledge was shared freely between species. Children grew up knowing that they lived in a galaxy where freedom and justice were more than just words. Lisa Carter lived to see the establishment of the new order, but passed away peacefully in her sleep, knowing that her life's work was complete. Her funeral was attended by representatives from across the galaxy who honored her as one of the founders of galactic freedom. Jake spoke at the ceremony about how her faith had kept hope alive during the darkest times. The former burial chamber beneath the temple was converted into a memorial for all those who had died fighting for freedom. Jake visited it often to remember the price that had been paid for liberty. The inscription on the memorial read simply that here the old order had died and the new hope had been born. Some Zeltharian hardliners continued to cause trouble in remote systems, but they were isolated and outnumbered. The Federation's military forces led by human officers and staffed by volunteers from all member species were strong enough to maintain peace. Democracy and freedom had taken root across the galaxy. Jake reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day when he had been sentenced to live burial. The accident that had killed 12 Zeltharian workers had led to over a century of oppression, but also to the eventual liberation of the entire galaxy. Sometimes the worst tragedies could lead to the greatest triumphs. The Federation faced many challenges as it grew. Different species had different values and needs. Economic systems had to be rebuilt. Old hatreds had to be overcome. But Jake had learned that humans possessed something special that made them natural leaders in building bridges between different peoples. As guardian of the Federation, Jake traveled constantly between worlds, solving disputes and preventing conflicts. His enhanced lifespan meant he could serve for centuries, ensuring continuity and stability. The biosuspension technology that had once been his prison had become the tool that let him protect galactic peace. Jake often stood in the same spot, where he had once watched the sunrise over New Haven as a young colony leader. Now he watched ships from dozens of different worlds coming and going in peaceful trade. The galaxy was no longer divided between rulers and slaves, but united in common purpose. The inscription on the memorial was right. The old order of empire and oppression had died in that burial chamber. From its grave had risen something better. Humanity had shown the galaxy that freedom was worth any sacrifice, and that even the deepest grave could not bury the hope for a better tomorrow.